Good evening. There are eight days left until the general strike against the status quo, against the duopoly, against Congress, against politics as usual, right? It's time to fix the way that things work in this country. And the way that we can do that is by unionizing as voters and demanding that Congress pass our crowdsourced legislative package, the Blueprint for a Better America, in exchange for our votes. This legislative package will end poverty with universal basic income, end mass incarceration with major criminal justice reform, and end the endless wars by downsizing our military and improving our moral standing in the world. Tonight, we're going to talk more about what the details, what exactly that means to improve our moral standing in the world. But first, I'm going to start these sessions off by reciting the preamble to the Constitution to remind us of our duties as Americans. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Those are our 5 duties as Americans, both individually and collectively. And the Blueprint for a Better America uses those 5 duties as its framework. And so we've already gone through Title I, establishing justice, and talked about the criminal justice reform provisions there. We've gone through Title II, ensuring domestic tranquility and the truce over guns and abortion, those wedge issues that Republicans and Democrats use to drive the American people apart, to stop us from working together. And by using a truce for 10 years, we can come together and instead focus on what are the real problems that we want to solve. And tonight, we're going to continue with Title III, providing for the common defense. So we've got, just pull up the screen here real quick and we'll look a little bit more at what we're going to go over this evening. All right, Title III. By the way, you can find this legislative package on our website, anamericanunion.com, or the easiest bit.ly link, bit.ly/BBA, all capital letters, and then lowercase Dropbox. We'll bring up this legislative package for you. All right, Title III. We're in Subtitle B, Improving America's Moral Standing in the World. Starting with restricting the use of economic sanctions against civilian populations, to provisions related to Saudi Arabia's war on Yemen. We're going to suspend arms transfers, stop selling them the weapons that they're using against the people of Yemen, and stop supporting them as well. There's a prohibition on the purchases of landmines and lethal autonomous weapons. Both of those, lots of things to talk about with both of those. And then closing Guantanamo Bay military prison. So I've got a full agenda tonight. And let's go ahead and get right into it. All right. So economic sanctions. What are economic sanctions? On a presentation last fall, Margaret Flowers defined them as unilateral coercive economic measures. We've talked about civil asset forfeiture, and civil asset forfeiture, where you take somebody's stuff, at least there's a process, right? That you can appeal, that you can, there is a process, even if it's lopsided and unjust. But unilateral coercive economic measures, sanctions, applied to a whole country, there's no due process. It's not like the country can say, we'd like an appeal, we'd like a day in court where we can prove that these sanctions are unjust. Like, that's not a thing. It's just the United States says this is what we're doing, and there's nothing you can do about it. When you apply this to an entire country and say, all you guys are going to be penalized because we've dictated that that's the way it's going to be. This is a form of collective punishment. Collective punishments are a violation of United Nations standards to penalize the entire population of the country. In many cases, because they've had the audacity to have a government that the United States doesn't approve of. But for those civilians, because the people in the government that are the most connected usually have more money, resources, whatever, are able to work around sanctions. But for a population's poorest, most vulnerable members, those are the ones that the sanctions fall on the hardest. If you look at North Korea versus South Korea, it's genetically the same people, but yet the population of North Korea is malnourished and visibly shorter than their relations in South Korea, in large part as a result of being cut off from world markets. The US sanctions in Iran escalate inflation. It impacts family budgets. It's like a reverse universal basic income. Those with the least resources get hurt the most. Now, according to the website sanctionskill.org, the United States is currently imposing sanctions on Afghanistan, Belarus, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Burundi, Central African Republic, China, Comoros, Crimean region of Ukraine, Cuba, Cyprus, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Haiti, Iran, Iraq, Kyrgyzstan, Laos, Lebanon, Libya, Mali, Mauritania, Moldova, Montenegro, Myanmar, Nicaragua, North Korea, Palestinian territories, Russia, Rwanda, Serbia, Somalia, South Sudan, Syria, Tunisia, Venezuela, Yemen, and Zimbabwe. Like, the United States has cast a very wide net with its use of sanctions. And when you designate a country like Venezuela as a national security threat, it's like a public notice that someone is under criminal investigation. Discourages businesses, countries from doing business with them, from investing in them. And it just exacerbates economic problems. There was a study released a few years ago finding that the economic sanctions in Venezuela had cost as many as 40,000 lives. And when we're killing tens of thousands of civilians, there's really not any justification for that. We are in the wrong. We can do better. We can improve our moral standing by stopping that. And that's what the Blueprint for a Better America will do. We complain about the gridlock in Washington, but they still get some stuff done. Last November 1st, the Senate passed S-1064, the Reinforcing Nicaragua's Adherence to the Conditions for Electoral Reform Act of 2021. We, the United States, had conditions on how Nicaragua's elections should be managed. Just let that sink in for a second. So anyways, so the Senate passed this on November 1st, and on November 3rd, the House passed it, and a week later, it was law. Does this sound like the members of Congress are really doing their due diligence? They're really like thinking, considering whether or not countries should be sanctioned, or are they just rubber stamping these kind of things? So let's go ahead and open up this legislative package here real quick and just go over the details. All right, restricting the use of economic sanctions. Okay, so the first part of this, subsection A, deals with the prohibition, the restrictions on Iran, and all these things that restrictions that are in place. Leaves in place the part about being able to freeze assets. Still requires the president to keep Congress informed, and make sure that there's the president, all of these parts about prescribing regulations and things all stay in place. But we're scratching out this part about allowing imports and exports to Iran. In subsection B, we are adding a new term to the US code. This whole section 7201 deals with unilateral sanctions. So we've got unilateral agriculture sanctions and unilateral medical sanctions. And we're very clear that those kind of things aren't supposed to, we're not supposed to do that. And so we're adding a new term of unilateral economic sanctions. That means any prohibition, restriction, or condition on non-specific imports or exports with respect to a foreign country or foreign entity that is opposed by the United States for reasons of foreign policy or national security, unless you've got exceptions in here, unless it's part of a multilateral regime and the other member countries of that regime have agreed to impose substantially equivalent measures. So going back to the definition of what economic sanctions are, and as Margaret Flowers called them, unilateral coercive economic measures. If these are not unilateral, if it's not just us, and it's part of a larger coalition, then they can be considered. The other way is a mandatory decision of the United Nations Security Council, in which case we would comply. It's okay to comply with UN decisions. So then we go through and we add that definition, unilateral economic sanctions, to the lists that the president can't impose, and requires that the president describe the current actions by the foreign country or foreign entity that justify imposing the sanctions. So again, there needs to be something that would currently justify these economic sanctions, not something that happened long ago in the past, but something that you're trying to address today. This can't be an ongoing thing for no good reason. And that's why we get through adding that phrase here again. When we get to subsection F, and flipping the meaning of this around to say that this chapter shall be construed to nullify the provisions relating to the sanctions on Cuba. And so when we talk about, penalizing a country for in the long term, these sanctions, this embargo on Cuba, is a result of their revolution back in 1959. Like 5 out of 6 Cubans weren't even alive back then, and they're still being penalized for it. The United Nations, they, for 29 years now, they have introduced resolutions that, quote, that recognize the quote, necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. And last year, the vote was 184-2. The rest of the world recognizes that what we're doing is wrong. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we made it harder for Cuba to get ventilators, things that they needed, and we are causing unnecessary suffering. One of the planks is ending the endless wars. And again, this is something that has been going on far, far too long. It's time to re-examine, reevaluate, and do better. Mexico wanted to send supplies to Cuba last summer, but they couldn't use a commercial carrier because the commercial carriers know that they're going to get in trouble from the United States if they actually ship things to Cuba. So Mexico had to get one of their naval vessels to bring things to Cuba. We can do better. we can end the use of economic sanctions against civilian populations. And that's what Section 332 does. All right, Section 332, suspension of arms transfers to Saudi Arabia. What this will do, it is based on S-398, the Saudi Arabia Accountability and Yemen Act of 2019. It's introduced by Senator Menendez from New Jersey. And what it would be is a 5-year suspension on arms transfers to Saudi Arabia. So it's not a total ban. It's based on current circumstances. Saudi Arabia can get back into, can have this lifted after a 180-day ceasefire. You have to see sincere words and sincere actions, and then this can be lifted. But on the effective day of this section, any of these licenses to sell bombs, sell military equipment, any of that stuff becomes revoked, and nothing else can be sold to Saudi Arabia, with one exception for ground-based missile defense systems. Those would still be permitted. Let's see a little bit more about Saudi Arabia. According to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Saudi Arabia is the world's largest arms importer from 2015 to 2019. And 73% of their arms imports came from the United States. Now, Donald Trump was proud of these arms sales because they create jobs. And obviously there's some truth to that. But if you look at how many jobs does it actually create, and are they here in the United States or in other parts of the world? They said best case scenario, 40,000 jobs. Okay, that is definitely a non-zero number. But we have a labor force of 160 million in this country. So we're talking like a few hundredths of 1%. Is that worth contributing to the war on Yemen? Is that worth the United States knowing that we're the ones who sold them the bomb that was dropped on a school bus and killed 40 preteen boys? Like, we built that bomb here in America. Lockheed Martin did. And we sold it to Saudi Arabia, and all those boys are dead as a result. No, we can do better. Again, yeah, this creates a non-zero number of jobs. But if your job is to make the bombs that blow up children, then you should find a new job. And we're, as part of our legislative package, the Blueprint for a Better America, ending poverty includes universal basic income. So we're going to make sure that nobody is falling into poverty because their job at the bomb making factory got shut down. We're going to make sure that there's a safety net under every American, not a safety net that's full of holes, but a safety floor. We'll talk more about that when we get into UBI. Yeah, the crisis in Yemen has been going on for years, 7 years, and there's been a ceasefire this year that things have gotten better, and we can help keep them that way by stopping selling bombs to Saudi Arabia. All right, I'm going to move on to Section 333, Prohibition on Military Support. This is the logistical and technical support that we have given to Saudi Arabia for their war for many years. And this comes from an amendment that was offered by Representative Adam Smith of Washington during the 2020 National Defense Authorization Act. And the House adopted it. The House was like, yeah, let's stop doing this, 240 to 185. And then the Senate didn't, and so it died. And this would be a 5-year ban on supporting Saudi Arabia's military campaign. No more giving them intelligence for their offensive strikes, no more logistical support for their bombing campaign unless there's an imminent threat or the president has specific authorization from Congress. You know, back in January, the Saudi coalition, they bombed a detention facility full of migrants, and the airstrikes reportedly killed 91 detainees and injured 226. And it was the worst civilian casualty in 3 years in Yemen. Now, the greatest killer of children in Yemen isn't the cholera epidemic, but it's starvation. Saudi Arabia has devastated Yemen's economy on purpose with their blockades and with their attacks. And children are starving. Parents are watching their kids wither away because they have nothing to feed them. We can do better. UN Special Envoy Hans Grunberg, he reported to the Security Council back in January. This was 2 weeks before the detention facilities bombed. He said that no long-term solution would be found on the battlefield. He said, quote, genuine political will, responsible leadership, and adherence to the interest of the entire population is needed. So let that be us. We, the people of the United States, can produce the genuine political will in 2022. We can say this is wrong, and we are not going to help. We can't be silent anymore. The people of Yemen can't wait. You know, I am currently fasting as part of the fast for peace leading up to October 15th. And today is day 14. My weight is still hovering at around 182 pounds. I've kind of plateaued there for the last 4 days. But the first really long fast that I did was 2018, 2019, 2018, I think it was. I joined the hunger strike for Yemen, and it was finally on day 19. I started eating. I started taking liquid calories again to try and draw attention to this problem. And it's still, again, the ceasefire, it's still much better. But let's have a permanent solution, and let's improve America's moral standing in the world by saying, no, we're not going to help anymore. Section 334, this is the one that deals with unethical weapons. And so I'm going to talk about each of them separately. I don't know if you want to see the text of sections 332, 333, check out the text of the blueprint. Prohibiting purchase of landmines and lethal autonomous weapons. So there's a section of the US Code that deals with how contracts and stuff work. And so we create a new section that prohibits the purchase of these unethical weapons. Now, the first of these is landmines, and landmines have been around for a long time. They say that back in the Civil War that you kind of saw the precursors of these things, but the anti-personnel mines that are still in use today were used on a wide scale in World War II. Used in many conflicts, the Vietnam War, the Korean War, the first Gulf War, and during the Cold War, many states laid out long stretches of landmines across borders. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One would be reduce the personnel costs, right? You don't have to have as many guards watching your border if you just put a whole bunch of bombs out there to make it, no man's land, so nobody dares cross it. So maybe you reduce your personnel costs, but what about the ethical costs? Especially like in places like Vietnam and things like that, the real purpose of landmines and things like that wasn't to kill, but it was to maim, right? If you've got a group of soldiers moving through the forest, wherever, and then one of them gets their leg blown off, now you've got a whole new problem for that squad to deal with. What do you do with this injured person? Do you bring them back? Do you bring them with it? How do you do? And so that was sort of the purpose, was to, to make the enemy use up extra resources in trying to deal with these new problems. So the world for quite a while has realized that landmines are bad. And in 1997, in Ottawa, they developed the Mine Ban Treaty. And so this is a legally binding international agreement that bans the use, production, stockpiling, and transfer of anti-personnel mines, and requires that countries clear these affected areas, assist victims, and that they destroy stockpiles. And when this was being developed, America was on board for a while and then said, you know what, we've got like a bunch of like 5 conditions or so that we just want exceptions and things like that, that it shouldn't apply to us. And the rest of the world said, you know, no, this is the deal. So the United States decided not to sign. One of the reasons that they gave for backing out was Korea, that landmines were important to defending the border between North Korea and South Korea, because, you know, it was 70 years ago when the Korean War was going on that, you know, we have economic sanctions on North Korea, and what, they can't come out till they say they're sorry, I guess. Anyways, so President Obama, he started improving our policy with landmines and said basically, you know, that we're not going to buy any more and we're going to restrict them to using them in Korea. So that was an improvement. And then President Trump came along and he ended up reversing that policy. And then this year, President Biden reversed it again. And well, it's good. It drives home the point that as long as this is presidential policy, because Congress is dropping the ball and Congress is not acting the way that they should, presidents can just flip-flop back and forth, and the United States doesn't have a really strong position. And Biden has said that we're not going to produce or develop or acquire any more landmines. We're not going to export them. We're not going to transport them other than for activities related to mine detection and for the purposes of destruction. We're not going to use them anywhere except the Korean Peninsula. And we're going to try and destroy all of our landmine stockpiles except for what's needed to defend the Republic of Korea. The International Coalition to Ban Landmines, who in 1997 actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in bringing about that international treaty. They have pointed out that the mines on the Korean Peninsula aren't even under U.S. responsibility anymore. They've been turned over to the South Korean armed forces. And so there's no reason that we couldn't join the mine ban treaty. And there has been broad support for this. In 2010, 68 members. So this is a treaty. And as the Constitution says, the Senate has to ratify treaties by a 2/3 vote. So in 2010, 68 senators signed a letter asking Obama to put this treaty before them. It was 58 Democrats and 10 Republicans. And the ball got dropped. It didn't happen. So, well, you can't put a ratification of a treaty into a legislative package. That's not a thing. It's this whole separate deal. But what we can do in a legislative package is codify the prohibition on purchasing landmines. And so that's what this section does. Before I talk about lethal autonomous weapons, I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen again, and we can look at the language here, how this works. All right, what's going on? Ruh-roh. Well, I may be having technical difficulties. I hope this is still going through. All right. All right, so we got section 334, the prohibiting purchases, and that means we'll put this new section in, prohibition on certain unethical weapons. Statement of purpose. That is that humans, not machines, are legal and moral agents in military operations and are responsible for ensuring and understanding that any attack complies with the laws of war. That's our purpose. Here's the no contract may be negotiated, initiated, implemented, or completed if the contract includes development or procurement of unethical weapons. All right, great. What is an unethical weapon? An unethical weapon means devices which are intended to kill, maim, or otherwise injure a human being without direct action initiated by a human operator. Unethical weapons include landmines and other lethal autonomous weapons, but do not include missile defense systems. So if you're trying to target a human being, no, then only humans should be able to do that. And we'll talk a little bit more about in the lethal autonomous weapons section, the reasons for that. Term development means the act or process of creating and includes designs that enable conversion from a compliant to a non-compliant category solely by software updates. So you can't build a landmine or lethal autonomous weapon and say, oh, it's not unethical because it requires a human, whatever, push a button to activate it. And then just by virtue of a software patch, eliminate that. You actually have that's proactively closing that loophole. Lethal autonomous weapons means weapon systems that once activated can select and engage human targets without further intervention by a human operator. Yeah. Penalties. So for the penalties, we went with a donation to a financial penalty that would go to the international campaign to ban landmines, and say that it shall be the greater of $1 million or twice the cost incurred, or the total costs incurred under the violation, and providing the specifics of the items in violation, including quantity, cost, technical details, estimated casualties that would be produced by the unethical weapons. So having to turn over all the technical details publicly in this scenario. Yeah. So, all right. And so that covers the, 1 second. All right, so let's talk a little more about lethal autonomous weapons. Millions of people have seen the Terminator franchise, these automatic killing machines. And while those are hopefully still a ways in the future, we're using more things like that these days. Just recently, the Russian military, they flew a dozen self-destructing Iranian-supplied drones hundreds of miles across Ukrainian territory. And these are drones that they're able to crash into things and blow them up. Not necessarily autonomous at this point, but Israel in 2020 used a remote controlled AI assisted machine gun because satellite trying to do it in real time would involve some lag. And so they set up cars and things on a road and set up a facial recognition camera to identify the driver was the Iranian nuclear scientist they wanted to assassinate. And when they did, bang, shot him in his car. And on one hand, you can say, well, it's better than blowing up the whole car because then there's other innocent people that are involved in it. But this is a slippery slope. This is a very dangerous road to go down. And again, we have the opportunity to lead by example and say, no, we are not going to develop these things. Now, the website autonomousweapons.org offers like 7 reasons why we shouldn't develop lethal autonomous weapons. I want to go through those, try and go through those quickly. One is unpredictability. Again, if you've seen the Terminator movies, you know what Skynet is, where you give this computer program control over our nuclear weapons or world movie war games, and then next thing you know, you've got you've got the computer making decisions that are not good for the human race. And so, yeah, that unpredictability. Escalation. This happens in the stock market sometime, where we have these AI automatic traders, and sometimes they get triggered and they start selling real fast or buying real fast, and the stock market goes fluctuating real quickly. And okay, that's all, maybe mildly amusing or whatever, but that's those are with stocks. That's not something that you want to see escalate quickly when it comes to machines whose primary purpose is to take human life. Then there's the matter of proliferation. The more that these weapons are developed, the more likely it is that they're going to end up in the hands of dictators and terrorists. And so let's not contribute to proliferation. The more that we do, the more that these are developed, it lowers their costs, and it lowers barriers to conflict. It makes it cheap to start fights. When you can have these automatic killing machines go out and about into the and fight your battles for you. And which is the next point of mass destruction, where one person can control or can oversee or can direct many, many weapons and say, okay, this swarm go attack there, this swarm go attack there. And you magnify the amount of harm and the amount of damage that can be done by each individual person. Even more concerning, though, is that the way that the AI can be used to selectively target different groups of people. You could target them based on age. You could target them based on their gender, on their race, on their ethnicity, on their religious dress, and have these autonomous weapons specifically target groups of people. This is not a technology that we want to encourage by investing in development in the United States. And then last but not least, an AI arms race. Now, the very term arms race means that you're favoring speed over safety. Let's get this done fast. And this is, again, not something to rush into. Safety should be the primary concern when it comes to things like this. So those are a bunch of reasons why we should not develop them. The International Red Cross is recommending states regulate lethal autonomous weapons with three core pillars of: 1, no human targets, restrict unpredictability, and require human control. Because it's been argued that autonomous weapons that target humans would violate the Martens Clause. This is a provision of international humanitarian law that establishes a moral baseline for judging emerging technologies. And these systems, they'd violate the dictates of public conscience because they would, quote, undermine the principles of humanity, because they would be unable to apply compassion or human judgment to decisions to use force. the ability to apply, to have compassion, the ability to use human judgment, that's what makes us human. Is that, we've all seen movies or whatever where, the hero, the bad guy, the soldier, whoever, comes across a scenario and applies human judgment and says, okay, just, go on, or looks the other way or whatever. Lethal autonomous weapons don't have that capability. That's why human control is essential when it comes to war, because humans have the capability to make these decisions. Let me just touch back on the legislative language. Some of that comes from a 2019 paper published by Georgia Tech's Robot Lab website called Autonomous Weapon System, a Road Mapping Exercise. And that's where some of that language came from. So the best time to address this was like 5 years ago, to establish clear guidelines ahead of time. The second best time is this year, right now, in 8 days, with the general strike, saying, look, Congress, get this done. Fix this problem. We don't want Terminators. We don't want Skynet. We don't want killer drones targeting people based on their race or their appearance or their religious dress. Let's establish a very clear principle, not one that's not a policy that is subject to whoever happens to control the White House in the Oval Office, but instead a codified section of the law that says we're not going to do this. We have an opportunity to be leaders to the rest of the world, and that we're not going to buy or develop these. And to quote Sarah Connor from the Terminator movies, there is no fate but what we make. All right. One of the questions that does come about this, though, is if we don't develop this technology, but other countries do, does that put us at a disadvantage? And if you've ever seen the movie Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, there's the scene where Dr. Strangelove is talking about the being able to put people into caves, into mine shafts, to protect the human race when the doomsday weapon goes on. And we've got to develop these. We must not allow a mine shaft gap. Look, thinking the worst of others and assuming that other people are going to do this too, so we better do it first, that is a policy choice. We can think better of others, and we can lead by example. That's what this legislation, Section 334 of the blueprint, would do. All right, last but not least, closing the Guantanamo Bay military prison. It's been 20 years. 20 years. It was back on January 11th of 2002, just a few months after the September 11th attacks, that a Navy photographer snapped a picture of 12 hooded men. I'm sorry, not 12, 20 hooded men, all shackled and kneeling inside barbed wire fence, wore orange jumpsuits, and they were the first of about 780 men who would ultimately be detained inside Guantanamo Bay military prison. And after 20 years, the vast majority have been let go, the vast majority without being charged with a crime or anything like that. And we've still got about 36 men there. But what is the cost? What is the cost of keeping Guantanamo Bay open? Well, the first is the financial cost, and it costs more than $500 million. That's 540 million was the last number that I saw. And so if you divide that by 36 prisoners that we have left, $15 million a year, $15 million a year, $15 million a year per prisoner. Okay. That's a ridiculous amount of money. That's the financial cost. But I should point out too that when we put in the United States, the cost of holding someone in a maximum security prison is about $78,000 a year. So tiny fraction of what we're paying for Guantanamo Bay. However, there is a perk, I guess, if you can call it that, to keeping people in Guantanamo Bay, and that's because it is outside the actual boundaries of the United States. The Supreme Court has ruled that many of these traditional legal protections don't apply. In the Constitution, in Article 1, Section 9, the Constitution says, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. Now, we are not at a declared war. The attacks of September 11th that led to the war in Afghanistan, that war is over as well. And yet, we're still holding dozens and dozens of men, most of whom who haven't been charged with anything, most of whom who have actually been cleared for release and just not been able to leave yet. So it's not just the financial cost, it's the moral cost of keeping Guantanamo Bay open. Because holding these men for years and years, it just serves as a reminder that America is failing to live up to its own standards, the one that millions and millions of school children pledge every day with liberty and justice for all. We get criticized around the world by countries like Russia and Pakistan and Libya and the Sudan and Iran. They criticized us for holding people without charges. And Joe Biden has pledged to shut it down, just like President Obama did. And we are making progress. He is reducing the number. When we did the public hearings on this section back in the first quarter of this year, there were 39 men, so we're down to 36. But Congress, the Republicans and Democrats, they're afraid of appearing weak on national security. And so they've kind of banded together to block the commander-in-chief from relocating a military prison. And so those Republicans, those Democrats, those members of Congress, they need courage. And that courage can come from us. We can inspire them to do better. We can inspire them to live up to our first duty under the Constitution, which is establish justice. And locking people up for decades without charging them with anything is not justice. So the Supreme Court has given mixed opinions about what exactly is the status of these men in Cuba and not in the United States. And it was in 2004 that they ruled in Russell versus Bush that detainees had a right to a habeas review. But those didn't quite materialize. And as we've said, most of the men who are still there have been cleared for release and just haven't been released. So we've got to do something different. Let's take a look at the legislative language and see exactly what that looks like. Closing Guantanamo Bay military prison. All right. Subsection A. We're going to set a date certain, notwithstanding any other provision of law. Remember how I said Congress has tried to block the president from closing Guantanamo Bay? Notwithstanding any other provision of law, the president shall close the Department of Defense detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, not later than February 28th, 2023. So, passage at the end of October, 4 months. 4 months to figure out what to do with 36 people. Here's what we can do. All right, so then the teeth of this is the restriction of funds. You can't spend any money in fiscal year 2023 or fiscal year 2024 for that facility unless it is for the following reasons. One, transfer to the United States disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, for the purpose of pretrial detention or detention during a trial or while serving a sentence. So if somebody's actually been charged with something, somebody's been convicted of something, or is on trial for something, then we can transfer them to Fort Leavenworth and go through due process not indefinite detention, but due process. B, continued detention in the Guantanamo Bay facility for an initial period not to continue beyond June 30th, 2023, upon written certification by the Secretary of Defense and the ranking members of the Committee on the Armed Services and of the Senate and House, that additional time is needed to complete these things. So if 4 months isn't enough, they can certify that they need another 4 months. But after that, after 6 months, by June 30th, 2023, you wouldn't be able to spend money on keeping people in Guantanamo Bay. All right. Next thing you can spend money on is transferring any such person to another country, provided that transfer complies with the convention relating to the status of refugees and the United States Convention Against Torture and other forms of cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, as well as ensure that these individuals that are transferred, if they assert a well-founded fear of torture, abuse, or persecution, they have an opportunity, just like other immigrants, to get a judicial review. And last, you can use the money to release any other person if you aren't able to fit them in those three categories. Clarify that transferring them into Fort Leavenworth, Kansas does not consider entry into the United States for purposes of immigration. If Congress thinks Fort Leavenworth isn't really the best place, after this is codified, they can amend the destination and an authorization for appropriation. So that's how we can close Guantanamo Bay in 2023. It has been 2 decades. It is a moral stain on America that we hold people without charges. That's not that's not what America is supposed to be about. Yeah. So we can do better. John Oliver last week tonight, he did a segment on Guantanamo Bay not too long ago. And so he summed it up and he said, when you see a bumper sticker that says freedom isn't free, this is what it means. It means standing up for our highest ideals, even when it requires accepting a certain amount of risk. That's what freedom is these are our highest ideals. This is our first duty under the Constitution, to establish justice. And so let's live up to the goals that the framers set out for us. Let's live up to our mission statement as Americans. Let us come together to establish justice and close Guantanamo Bay military prison and end the indefinite detention of people. That is what Section 335 does. So that concludes Title 3. Tomorrow we'll get into Title 4, promoting the general welfare. Welfare has a definition, means health, happiness, prosperity, and we're going to look at exactly how we can promote that through this legislative package starting tomorrow and for the next couple of days. So I hope you'll join us again on Saturday evening, 7 p.m. Eastern. Thank you for watching and have a good evening.